Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on what's ahead for Seattle's office market and office leasing. My name is Chris Gisel, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's webinar. Today, we'll be hearing from Emons Holmquist of Holmquist & Gardner, a Seattle-based law firm with a focus on helping businesses and those in both the commercial and residential real estate space with all of their needs. During today's session, Emons is going to provide us with an update on what business owners and leaders should know about the impacts of COVID-19 on our business community. And then we've also got a guest joining us today. Derek Hermson of Union Street Corporate Real Estate is going to talk with Emons a little later on. I'll let him introduce Derek at that time. But before I turn it over to Emons, I just want to remind everybody that's tuned in that you can submit questions through the webinar tool, through the Q&A tool, and we'll have an opportunity for questions throughout the program. So with that, I'll hand it over to Emons to give us the latest updates on government orders and what we need to know.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks everybody for coming. This is, I believe, our fourth webinar. They've been hugely successful and the feedback has been great. Thank you for attending. And we're just going to do a quick recap here of some of the things that are affecting us with regard to state statutes, county statutes, and city. Top of the list, obviously, Governance Lease Proclamation 2019-3 is extended to October 15th. That's the residential eviction moratoria. And King County has a commercial eviction moratoria. And basically where we're at is if you are trying to evict a tenant, you need to make sure that you have tried to make a reasonable payment plan with them. And landlords must offer a reasonable repayment plan to all commercial tenants in King County for any and all non-payment of rents occurring between March 1st, 2020 and March 1st, 2021. Failure to do that, in other words, failure to provide in writing a reasonable payment plan, will be a complete defense to eviction. So the standard of proof requirements for landlords will be that they provided that payment plan in writing and that tenant refused to comply or failed to comply having agreed to that plan. Now, keyword there is reasonableness, and they note that reasonableness is based on the individual financial health and other circumstances of the tenant. I think we can all read into that. It means that if you offer a tenant some kind of repayment plan that's 300% of rent each month until it's paid in full, and that's just not going to be physically possible, that's going to be deemed unreasonable out of the gate. So this is something that you could start right now if you're in this mode in preparation for what might happen when we can evict. All of this ordinance definitely can apply retroactively. In other words, I think this came down in July. This still means that we're talking about non-payment of rent back in March. So that if you're thinking that they didn't accrue the rent now, they accrued it in the past, I think you need to treat it like it's retroactive. Citywide ordinance here in the city of Seattle. We had a wonderful ordinance that removes, it's ordinance 126116 that removes personal liability with small business owners by rendering personal liability clauses and guarantees unenforceable. There's some gray area in that. This has not been fully litigated. I think this came down on July 27th. So we have not seen the full repercussions, but the parameters are pretty clear. Commencing March 1st, 2020, again, a retroactive through 6 months after whatever the extensions on any applicable moratoriums. You're not going to be able to collect against either an individual who's listed as a tenant or an individual who guaranteed the obligations under the lease. Qualifying tenants must be, now with regard to the eviction ordinance, small business owners or nonprofits. We're talking about less than 50 employees. We're talking about independent businesses with less than 5 franchise units, general sales and service businesses with 10 or less establishments worldwide, and entertainment uses with 5 or less establishments worldwide. And essentially what we're seeing at the state and city level, if you go to the city website, you'll see a toolbox for commercial tenants with a bunch of applications and different tools to amend leases and a link to complain. And then I think at the state level, at the AG's office, they've got a full website set up for complaints with regard to treatment of residential tenants. And so the complaint hotlines are up and functioning. I've only heard of 1 or 2 anecdotal situations where landlords have been hit, but when they've been hit, it's hit hard. And so these are being enforced. If you send out a eviction notice to a residential tenant, for example, and they are reported to the AG's office, we are looking at pretty hefty fines. And so this is not tangential, maybe type stuff. There's just no reason to push the boundaries on this. We are advising clients to start with the repayment plan process, get that in writing, document it, and obviously try to make it reasonable as possible. A number of these statutes, if you're not in the city of Seattle, each city has their own way of handling this. Each county has their own way of handling this. It's important to look at those before you take any action. And there are certain provisions about payment under within a year for the tenants, and other provisions that I think are a little more landlord friendly. However, since we haven't gone to litigation on these and haven't played them out, and certainly any litigation that ensues as a result of the ordinances themselves, i.e. some kind of spot taking or legislative taking analysis, that hasn't happened. So we're still awaiting all of that. Needless to say, each case deserves attention, and you should check with your attorney or us before moving forward on any enforcement. And then as a side note, practical matter, we are still advising our clients to make sure that they are, you know, at least apprising tenants of their obligations, even if it's not a notice to vacate. It's where are you at in terms of arrearages, so that there is at least a notice out there. And in some jurisdictions, you are not allowed to charge late fees or accrue interest on those. So just make sure when you're doing that, you're compliant with whatever your jurisdiction is on those things. So with that, the dry part of the discussion is over, and we're very fortunate today to have a great friend of mine and colleague, Derek Hermsen, with us. Derek has spent over 2 decades in the commercial real estate market, and during that time, he has exclusively worked on the tenant side, office and medical leasing field. And in 2015, Derek moved out on his own to found a brokerage, the Union Street Corporate Real Estate, and he's had great success. I've had the great pleasure of working with him on a number of leases. And this is a guy that when I refer clients to Derek, he's a Jedi. He knows what's available, what's going on in the marketplace. So very fortunate. Thank you, Derek, for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Imans.
So we're in interesting times, and as has been the case in our other webinars, I think the first question is basically where are we at specifically in Seattle in terms of trends coming into end of Q3, heading here into Q4. What's going on? What are you seeing?
So trending wise, I'll start with my meat and potatoes, which are local professional service firms in Seattle. And those companies, which aren't really facility dependent, they're trying to work out short-term arrangements because a lot of them aren't even utilizing their space. And for some, it's out of convenience of just not having to move and store their stuff, maintain their servers. But really, it's been short-term solutions. So crafty local landlords have been pretty amiable to this and try to find ways to keep the tenants in the building as we get through this really awkward period.
So what are we seeing, say, in the professional sector right now? Talk to me about law firms, for example.
Yeah, law firms. So the legal industry is kind of like the real estate industry in that it's slower to adapt to technology use. And with COVID coming along and everyone having to learn to work remotely, there were a lot of capabilities learned by attorneys that, hey, I can work remotely and I don't need to have my assistant sitting right next to me, and he or she is really effective from his or her home. And so law firms are really looking at how much space do we need? And a lot of them, it's more about maintaining a downtown address and maybe not so much about having a dedicated space for every support staff or attorney. So right now, the market, I would say, is starting to become pretty saturated with small sublease opportunities, whether it's standalone suites for firms that have just decided to continue to work remotely, or they've had it's a larger firm with smaller subtenants that have withdrawn, and so they've got space available. And a lot of firms, big and small, have been impacted.
Yeah, it seems like we're seeing not so much a contraction. Well, the good news for all of us is, and maybe you agree or disagree with this, but not seeing a contraction of business size, like that the employees are still there. It's just, hey, we need a little bit less space. Is that kind of your read on it?
Yeah, for sure. And not only that, it's just trying to figure out how to use your space that you do have, cycling people through different people, different days, and when they are there, they need the space to spread out. So, you know, the larger firms and mid-sized firms that want to use their space and can't just continue to work from home, they're finding ways to get people back in if they need them there. And you know, leases have term, and they as lease obligations start to expire, that's when the real assessment will occur, and we'll see who's going to contract. But again, to your point, it's not necessarily headcount, it's space.
Yeah, and I guess part of the discussion here in Seattle is just what we're seeing in terms of people coming back in the office. Now, you're in the thick of this. We're all reading into a lot about COVID and what the inferences are for coming back to work and when people are going to come back to work. What are your thoughts about that and people working downtown Seattle generally?
Well, we've had a convergence of a lot of things that all occurred, you know, to create this storm. And before COVID, the office market was already in a state of decline. I mean, it had peaked, and it wasn't a steep decline, but it wasn't a plateau. It was moving downward. And then when the COVID pandemic hit, it accelerated everything. And people had to learn to work remotely. And guess what? Technology and cloud capabilities are there, and people adapted. And they saw that it wasn't as hard as maybe they thought, and a lot of those barriers weren't there, or they were overcome. And so between an already declining market, a pandemic, and technology, then you've got the other piece. Downtown's just not pleasant. I mean, you know, the gyms are closed, the restaurants are closed. There are demonstrations, and there are, you know, police that aren't appreciated, and you've got a city council that's making it a difficult business environment. So, you know, between not wanting to really come downtown, having the ability to work remotely, stay effective and productive, this storm just really changed the whole face of, you know, how office space is viewed.
Yeah, I think we went through some interesting decisions with big tech sort of leading the way with regard to mandatory attendance at work, with you, whether you're essential or non-essential, and then with regard to office space. I think we've all kind of followed along when Amazon said, hey, you know, you don't have to come back till the end of the year, and that was back in like May or something. They were very early, and I think there's been some trending in that way. I will say that I'm still in the camp where I like coming downtown. I like the office. I'm hopeful that we can get our city council aligned with our values and make it a more pleasant place. But I think in our discussion yesterday, you were pointing out some interesting data points here that I think would be helpful for our audience to take a look at with regard to total square footage in Seattle, available office space. Maybe we can put some of that up and have a little discussion around that.
Sure, but I know why you like coming downtown, Imant. It's because the commute's a lot easier. You can find parking anywhere now. You just go straight up to your office, and it's quiet. You don't have your kids homeschooling and yelling at you. It makes sense.
That and the Met still makes a hell of an old fashioned.
Yeah, I'm not here for Blue Water Taco.
All right. So walk us through this sheet here. I think this is very interesting.
Yeah. So I tried not to just vomit data at you, but I'm not really up for graphics. But I wanted to just show, this is through CoStar. It's a multiple listing service and data provider that all commercial brokerages use. And so, you know, you grab a swath of downtown, which is that image there on the left, and that shows, you know, you got 52 million square feet of office space in 290 buildings. And what I was just starting to demonstrate is what's occurred since the peak. and I mentioned it happened before COVID. And the peak was, depending on which metric you look at, but you could say it was the fourth quarter of 2018. And since then, we've just seen the availability of space continue to increase. And right now it's at 83% increase over 7 quarters. That's a lot. So what that means is it's basically 4 million square feet that's come up. So we were at 4.73 million square feet in 2018 at the tail end there. And now there's 8.67 million square feet of available space. And Imans, when we talked about this before, I felt I wanted to clarify what available means. A lot of the newspaper outlets and brokerages will cite vacancy rates and vacant space. But what's really important to look at is available space, because companies generally have 6 months to a year before they're needing to make a decision about space. So space that may not be vacant today is technically available, where that tenant may be vacating in the next few months, and that space is available for lease after that term. So availability of space is really one of the key things to watch, one of the key metrics.
And oh, look at this. Okay.
Yeah, so this is a graph. Again, this is pulled from the same data swath in CoStar. I wanted to demonstrate kind of how fast it's happened. And going back to the last recession, it was pretty similar in terms of the peak of the market. Back in, it looks like in this, it's the third quarter of 2006, there was availability of about 4.4 million square feet of space. And before the availability of space increased by 4 million square feet, it took 10 quarters to get there, back at the last downturn. And on the right side of the graph, it's showing where we are today. So it's that same peak, and the availability was 4.7 million at that peak. We were talking about that Q4 of 18. And here we are only 7 quarters later, and we've already hit that 4 million square foot increase in office space. So we're at 8.7 million square feet of available space. So it was 3 quarters of, 3 periods, quarters, faster to get there. And it's still accelerating. We're not done.
So, and this is where you talk about the totality of these like factors. They're really impacting the speed at which space is becoming available, and that combined with what's going on with the economy, that's the speed factor, you think?
Yeah, I wanted to just get a little bit more a vision of the quantity versus percentages. Percentages can be daunting, and you can always choose a stat that favors your arguments, like 83% increase of available space. But what is that? How much space is that? So here's how you quantify it. You look at it, we were at 4.7 million feet, and now it's 8.7 million square feet. And if you look at the graph there, look how fast it was the last 2 quarters. It goes boom, boom, and that's going to keep going.
Interesting. Chris, you had a clarification that you wanted to ask about?
Yeah, we had a question from the audience that says, Derek, when you say peak, is that the percentage of square foot leased or total square foot leased?
For me, if you went back 1 slide for me, Chris, that I was basing it off of, so that you see that little, let me see the, which one is it? What do I want to show? So 2018 Q4, that 4.7. So under total available square feet, that total, that was the number. That was the total I was saying is the peak as available, because before that it was slightly larger if I were to go back 1 more quarter. And so this was the lowest level of availability before we started to see it start to increase consistently. So total available space.
So that basically just demonstrates the trail to freedom and what we're looking at in terms of where we're at relative to the last little cycle that we went through. And again, I think there's reason for optimism. There's a few factors here that, fortunately I'm not in the brokerage world, but it seems like, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and that pandemic is going to at some point weave its natural course and put us back in a more normal course. So I think in a lot, and maybe again, agree or disagree with me, Derek, but a lot of this we're looking at is less cyclical economic issues and more, or at least a big part of it is due to just, we've got a COVID pandemic that has slowed a lot of stuff down.
Yeah, it's both
to
though. I mentioned that convergence, Mons, because the market was in decline before COVID. COVID just accelerated it. It was like gas on the fire. And this slide that just popped up shows that, in the last 4 quarters, there's been a 70% drop in activity. This is over 4 quarters. And this shows in leasing activity. This is again CoStar data. If you look down in 2018 when the market was healthy, it's over 100 transactions a quarter is normal. And it was at 40 last quarter. And there could be, this is a reflection, quite honestly, of a lot of short-term deals. Month-to-month extensions, 6-month extensions. Those aren't really counted probably as transactions because those are happening. So I do think there'll be some pent-up demand for sure because everybody's feeling out this year. 2020 is a dumpster fire and no one really wants to make any commitments or do anything. It'd be nice to see some restaurants open downtown, but they can't until people come back. So there's a lot of holding of breath right now. But again, this slide was just to show that, from the peak of in 2018, they're doing over 1 million square feet of deals a quarter, and we're down to about 250,000 square feet. That's not a lot of space.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and I think it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And so now we've got the crystal ball analysis, which we've all been waiting for.
Yeah, no, this again was just trying to compare it back to our last downturn. And the graph's not really clear, it's confusing, but there's time across the bottom, those are years. And on the right side, that's the market rent per square foot on an annual basis. And the left side shows the vacancy percentage. And so this is vacancy. So this is not availability, this is vacancy. But what I wanted to show is how fast vacancy increased during that last downturn. And that graph, that orange, just goes flying up because the available space, a lot of it is sublet space, and eventually it becomes vacated or those expire and there's just more vacant space as these things lag. And what happens is once you got empty buildings, rents finally start to go down. They move slowly though, not nearly as fast. And so if you look toward the right, you get to where we are today. And then I got out my pencils and crayons and kind of emulated what happened last time, because I believe that that's a very fair assessment of what's going to occur over the next 4 or 5 quarters. And, I kind of just loosely pegged the rent just dipping below, on average across the city of all this office space, below $40. And last time though, man, it went right back to rent. It was so cheap back then, but it went right back to where it used to be before. And I don't anticipate that big of a dip or fast of a dip, but the vacant space is going to increase quickly. We've got a lot more professional landlords in Seattle than we did during the last one. A lot more properties have traded. There's a lot more New Yorkers and foreigners and all kinds of stuff in Seattle now. And they got big piggy banks and they'll sit and hold their breath and wait this out. And they've got a high basis on these things. So they're not going to just let rents fall, and they got lenders breathing down their necks. So the concessions are going to be increasing and continue to increase, but the smart landlords are going to try to keep their buildings occupied and do those short-term deals, help companies feel this thing out, and then look to get even in a few quarters. They hope, we all hope, that there's a little bit of a recovery.
Absolutely, and I think
being on the tenant side, I love seeing this a little bit. Landlords have just been winning for too long, so it's really nice to see this coming back.
Yeah, it's great to see you make that point, because I was about to, that this is clearly a tenant representation, tenant rep chart, and what happens with rents as we move forward is definitely in question and room for debate, despite Derek's best efforts with his crayons. There is a world where, rents stay reasonably high and don't dip as far as this graph shows. But I think one thing that we know is changing, and I think we'll move to this, is some of the terms in our lease negotiations. And so one of the things we discussed yesterday, Derek, and I think would be helpful for our audience, is talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of maybe new clauses and leases and amendments that you haven't seen before.
Yeah, so I'm actually not seeing too much change due to the pandemic because most of the work that's going on are short-term deals. So, I mean, these are one-page amendments that say you have permission to stay here for month to month at your same rent and until otherwise, with some notice. So not a whole lot changing there, but on new leases, the only thing I've really seen that's probably, because of the pandemic is the force majeure clause is kind of extending and being clarified, separated between two periods, before the lease commences and after the lease commences. And so before a lease commences, there are a lot of things outside of tenants' control that could impact them being able to get into the space and start occupying and paying rent. And those are things like what we saw during early in the pandemic, contractors couldn't work. Construction was shut down, improvements couldn't get performed, and the city's permitting process was, there's no control over that. So the only thing I'm really seeing is landlords are being more lenient on things outside of the tenant's control before they get into the space. But after that, though, the typical force majeure clause language has kind of prevailed. I haven't really, I've seen the word pandemic show up in it, but it's still, you better be paying your rent.
Yeah, I'd agree with the assessment that they're just getting, our timeframes are a lot less tight and a lot less sticky on the landlord side. There's been, particularly with regard to the government parts of the process, I know jurisdictions, Kirkland, Redmond, particularly on the retail side, just the permitting office there, just that they have a reputation recently of being incredibly slow. And then now with the pandemic, we're dealing with all kinds of additional time blankets put in, keep an outside delivery date, of course, but the what ifs are a lot less punitive, and putting in additional rent clauses or delay damages or whatever, it's just, there's just a lot more flexibility in light of the absolute reality that certain industries took more time to get going, and if we had another shutdown would impact us. So I'd agree that the force majeure language, especially on office stuff, hasn't changed that dramatically. And we did in the past spend a lot of time on force majeure clauses in big construction build outs where there was going to be a period of years or something like that. But now it's all leases. You're looking at that secondary issue and not just applying the standard force majeure language in the lease itself, having to
And Imans, I'd want to add to that though. I'm talking more specifically to office. The retail world is completely different.
Yeah, that's a good delineation. One of the things we also talked about was that, while there aren't a lot of big full leases happening right now, there's still a lot of sort of one-page amendments. What are you seeing in terms of the formality or lack of formality among tenants in terms of getting those done?
Well, the smart landlords, again, are trying to be accommodating, and they're being open to these month-to-month agreements, 4-month extensions, 6 months extensions, whatever the tenant kind of dictates works best for their industry or their company. And let's see. So what was your original question though, Imans? I don't want to deviate too much.
Well, we've got some, there are some, I think we're obviously, I think yesterday we talked about.
Oh, you asked about the formality piece. There are some handshakes, sure. If a tenant keeps paying their rent and the landlord's not shoving an amendment in their face, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, and what are you seeing? I think we talked a little bit about the reaction to the eviction ordinance and how tenants are responding with regard to holdover or
well, that's making tenants pretty bold. I've had plenty, including law firms, just say they can't do anything. So, if our improvements are delayed in the new space, we'll just keep clunking along at our current rent month to month, and they kind of ignore, any threats of holdover rents doubling or anything. And I mean, landlords would be in a tough place to kind of enforce that stuff. So really it's been more of just trying to be friendly to each other, let the month to months happen, and they can't really do much.
Yeah, it's, I will say that there has been, when I get the call from a tenant, obviously we're on the landlord side just as much as we're on the tenant side, actually probably more heavily weighted towards landlords, but hey, what do I do here? I understand I don't have to pay right now. And that's just a complete misnomer. You certainly do have an obligation legally to pay. and you will end up paying if you have the money to pay. It's just when. And so to a lot of my landlords, I've been saying, well, if they're opting not to pay, I can't evict, but all those amounts are accruing, and all those amounts are going to be owed at some point. And I think that's an interesting situation that's sort of waiting to erupt here that I'm not sure a city council or state or county have contemplated. I'm sure there's more coming on this. I think there's going to be some legislation dealing with what we're going to do with the fallout. I mean, especially when you see that there's a obligation to do a reasonable repayment plan. I think it will not be okay, December 31st, 2020 has come and gone. Now evictions are on, and then you're just in court. And I think there's going to be a lot of my landlord clients, or just landlords in general, that are going to assume that, okay, now it's time to go get them. And if they haven't started with a repayment plan or put that in place, at least in Seattle, they're going to be in a world where they're, waiting a few weeks where maybe they could have already had that plan in place, repayment could have been started, and maybe the tenant failed to make a payment or something. And so then we're there. So I think on both sides of the equation, we've been saying this for months now, landlords and tenants need to communicate and get things done, but there will not be just a cliff where all of a sudden we're evicting everybody. I think there's going to be a lot of steps between, and I think we're going to see more legislation on it. So our ordinances.
Yeah, I agree, Iman. Tenants should pay their rent, and they're going to be in trouble if they don't. And I wanted to ask you something about your opening statement on the personal guarantee front, or leases with individuals as the entity. So what happens if the tenant goes into a state of default right now, and they've got years left on their lease? What are they able to just walk away without that guarantee being impacted? What occurs?
Well, and that's my point that I was just making, that the tenant still owes the money. I will qualify this with the fact that, again,
it's just delayed.
It's just delayed. It's like a 1031 exchange. You're still going to pay taxes on it, but that tax is deferred.
Okay, that makes sense.
So you just can't take them to court and say, Jim Smith owes me $105,000 in rent, so pay me, and get a judgment and start accruing 12% interest on it and attorney's fees. That doesn't mean that it's not owed. It just means for the moment, we're not going to, pull the ripcord on that. And so at some point it will come. And I imagine that this is going to be a world where there's going to be further guidance, and they're going to be saying pretty much to the kids in the playground, be nice to each other. And honestly, that's my advice anyway to most clients. So I think there's a perception, and maybe this is a general issue with the city council, that if we don't have these regulations, then landlords are just going to collapse on their tenants, which I don't have that in my world. My clients are doing what they can to help people. Landlord-tenant relationships are a long-term, doesn't matter which side of the coin you're on. And Derek, as you and I talked about yesterday, the last 5%, the last nickel should always be left on the table, for the reason that fighting for that last 5% is always going to cost you more in attorney's fees. And when you come back down the road years from now in a renewal, or you need something, you can expect retribution. And so similarly, we're in a tough time. If you are a tenant that's not communicating and put up, rack up a huge debt and don't talk about how you're going to take care of it, times are going to be tough when the rebound happens, or as we come out of the COVID pandemic. And if you're a landlord and you rush to enforce without making sort of best efforts to be a reasonable human being or entity, then you can expect, things to go sideways later on. So, there was an article we were going to spend some time talking about, the Seattle Times. I think we'll kind of skip that because I think your data covered that really well. And just in conclusion here, before we go into Q&A, walk me through sort of the light or many lights at the end of the tunnel for us here in Seattle, Derek.
Sure. First, I want to clarify, I always fight for that last nickel. You have to assess the value of that nickel versus other things that could happen in the future. But yeah, some light at the end of the tunnel. Amazon is still leasing very aggressively over in Bellevue, a couple million square feet recently announced. So that's just an example that we've got a strong technology sector here, and technology companies generally operate online in the cloud, have products in that world. So they're still going, and there's still going to be employees coming to this part of the world. So I see that continuing. I think you asked for light. I almost went back to dark. There's going to be lower rents in the future for smaller spaces, because I think there's going to be a plethora of small businesses that do elect to stay remote or significantly reduce their footprint just to retain an address in a meeting place. I think WeWork might see some benefit from this. They've had such a negative light shine down on them over the last year, but their business model is kind of set up for flexibility for companies that don't want to make long-term commitments. So I think WeWork might, as long as their enterprise clients don't all pull the plug, they might see some positives come out of this. So I think once we clean up downtown and get the boards off the walls, get the WAC open, get restaurants open, it'll start to come back. But right now, it's just, like I said, it's just white guys from Nebraska walking around as tourists and construction workers and zombies. That's what it is. It's still not a pleasant place to be.
Yeah, well, I do think we have a retail sector that'll be really excited to see, some of this COVID-related quarantining and staying at home and social distancing sort of move in a direction that allows us to be closer in proximity. I think retail, when you have a vibrant retail community, and Kemper Freeman would tell you this, you're driving a downtown area, and that's what makes it lively and fun for everybody. And I think I'm not going to discount the pandemic's impact on that. And I think once we get into that world where we're doing the things we used to do, it's going to have a great impact on business in Seattle and tenants and obviously occupancy. So with that, Chris, we got some questions from the audience.
Yeah, we definitely do. So if you're attending with us today and you have some questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, but I got a couple for you right now. Derek, someone submitted a question. They said they are someone who owns 2 businesses in Seattle, and they're seeing the same challenges with the council and how inhospitable the city is right at the moment, and they're less and less interested in maintaining their presence here. Do you think what we're seeing is both a reduction in lease renewals and no new business entering the market, or is it just less that's entering the market overall? And does that differ when you get downtown versus the east side?
Well, I think there are still companies and businesses wanting to be in Seattle, coming here, but same with Bellevue. But I do think there will be some flight for some companies that may want to be closer to home, realizing that they don't need the downtown presence. So the suburbs might pick up, an uptick eventually, because rents will drop fast there too. And so I expect rental rates to help because it has not helped the last few years. It's made the bottom line difficult for many businesses. So that might help, but I'm not sure. Did I answer that clearly enough, Chris? Did I get to the bottom of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that works. And the next question that we had kind of is an extension off of that. What are you seeing or thinking about when it comes to projections for retail space outside of the downtown core? So not Bellevue, not downtown Seattle, but just the region.
Well, I think that, when there's a smaller supply of space in more neighborhood type commercial and such, there's still a decent demand for that. There might be some turnover because of the impacts of COVID, but I expect those spaces to be leased up and new businesses coming in as soon as, there's, I don't know if there's ever going to be normalcy like the way it used to be, but once we get through the deep impacts of the pandemic, I expect that to be healthy. Neighborhood retail, you've still got awesome demographics. The residential market's going bonkers. And so there's still, good demographics for retail in the perimeter.
Got it. Someone asked, so they said they have 90 days to exercise their renewal clause. Is that something that they should exercise, or what should they be thinking about? What should they be doing?
Well, it depends on a few things. If there's not a neighboring tenant that wants their space, if they don't have someone else breathing down their neck, and there's not really a reason to exercise it to protect their position, then there's no rush. They could let it lapse. They would just have to understand that they would be exposed, that the landlord could lease it to someone else at that point. But by letting it lapse, I mean, first, if you need more time, go for it. But most options to renew are, for a set period of time with no concessions and market rents. Well, I wouldn't really want to go into arbitration right now to define what market rents are when you see them declining. When you're trending downward, most comps will be backward in time, and so I don't really see a reason to exercise an option. You'd be better off sending the signal to your landlord of letting it lapse. What you need, I need some improvements, and if I get this much free rent, we can commit to more term, and that's music to landlords' ears right now is commitment to time.
Perfect, thanks. Emons, I think this is a question for you. I have a tenant who's accrued substantial arrearages and we have a personal guarantee. What steps should we be taking in light of the moratorium from the mayor in the city of Seattle?
Yeah, I'm going to assume that's a commercial tenant. Did it say that in the first part of the question?
I would assume so, yeah. Didn't say, but
it wouldn't be a personal guarantee if it was a residential lease because it would just be them individually. So that was a poor question on my part. Yeah, so you're basically doing asking to set up a payment plan and set the stage for what's going to happen next. And you are doing all of that in writing. It's probably a nice phone call followed up by an email saying, here's, in light of our discussion about your failures to pay rent and arrearage is accruing, here's what we'd like to present to you. It's something definitely we would want to talk about and have a look at to make sure that there wasn't the slightest insinuation you'd be evicting if it fell into that small business category. So definitely call us to talk about it. But it is a situation where you're going to want to get the enforcement side against the tenant lined up, which would be, again, whatever your eviction remedy is going to be after the moratorium goes away first, because as always, possession is going to be the biggest issue later. And then secondarily, this whole payment thing, which I would assume applies also, but I don't think we know for sure, but with regard to personal guarantees and those kinds of things, yeah, you can't enforce and you can't sue, but there's no reason I don't think, couldn't have a discussion about a payment plan that incorporates that.
Got it. One last question here that we've got. Derek, for someone who's looking for a resource or their clients are looking for a resource on monitoring those commercial rent rates per square foot, where would you send them to? What should they be watching? How can they call you? All that good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Feel free to reach out. I'm always here as a resource and love to follow that stuff and really try to see the direction of trends. The sublease market is a key indicator right now, just watching the number of subleases pour onto the market. And what that does is it puts pressure on rents. Subleases are generally cheaper than direct lease space, and so that puts downward pressure, leverage in negotiating rents. And so a good resource besides calling me or emailing me let's see, what would be the best way? Just call me, because it literally, it's industry specific and it's space type specific. Smaller spaces kind of move a little differently than the big chunks. And so there's the resources that are out there. It can be a little deceiving and they're very generalized. And I would hate to point someone toward generic information. I don't like generic information. Call me.
Perfect. That's good to know. Easy enough. All right. So that's all the questions we had from our audience today. I'll turn it over to Emons here in a minute just to wrap us up and send us on our way for the rest of the day. But just want to thank everyone who joined us. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to Emons to continue the conversation. You can reach him via email at emons@lawhg.net or via phone at 206-438-9083. So Emons, I'll turn it to you to take us out.
Yeah, I guess I would emphasize, one, thanks for everyone for joining us. It was a great discussion. Derek is actually like I said earlier, a Jedi. There are other Jedi attorneys that are out there, but with regard to what space is available where on the tenant side and all of the nuance that you would want to know to make a well-reasoned decision as a tenant, Derek's the guy you call. And the reason I say he's a Jedi is not just because, he's got a great beard. It's also because he actually does have this stuff off the top of his head, and it's like very current. And actually a couple of times that I've discussed leases with him, I've been a little bit freaked out by how much he knows right off the top of his head about what floor there might be space coming available on, at what building, and which landlords are easier or harder or more difficult to deal with, which landlords give accommodations and rent inducements that are different than others. And I think that's what you're looking for. There are a lot of skilled brokers in Seattle. Derek is one of the highlight reel guys. So with that, we're going to wrap this up. If this is being recorded, if you have people in your office that want to see this, there'll be a link on our website really quickly. And our next webinar will be on adverse possession with Sydney Safley, one of our great associates. And we'll be talking about all that goes into boundary line disputes and adverse possession issues. There's been a lot of change in case law recently, and it's something that we really excel at. So we wanted to spend some time on it. And I think we're also going to try to have a surveyor on to talk about those issues. So that'll be on Thursday, October 8th. Look out for an email. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Bye.
Thanks so much.